Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this. This is Left Side of the Aisle, and I'm your host. My name's Larry Erickson. For the next half hour, I'm going to be your ranter and raconteur, talking about things important to me that I think you should pay some attention to. If you have any reactions to the show, you can email me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. And if you can catch that, you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. You'll see the URL down here somewhere a couple of times during the show. You can leave a comment there, or you can get the email address from there if you'd like. If you do email me, two requests. One, please put something in the subject line that makes it clear what this is about. It's not spam. And two, be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm lousy at answering my email. But you will get an answer. That's a promise. All right, we're going to start off, as I always like to when I can, with some good news. Last week, I told you about the upcoming expiration date of three provisions of the grossly misnamed Patriot Act, and the push by civil libertarians in Congress, and yes, there are some, to let those provisions die, especially one known as Section 215 of the Act. Section 215 was the one that was used to justify mass collection by the NSA, the National Security Agency, of so-called metadata on essentially every phone call, landline, or cell call made within, into, or out of the U.S. every day. Well, the House of Representatives didn't allow Section 215 to die, but it did do something good. By a vote of 338 to 88, which included majorities of both Democrats and Republicans, it passed the USA Freedom Act. Now, if this act becomes law, it would stop the NSA from storing domestic telephone toll records, create a panel of independent advocates at the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to advocate for privacy and civil liberties when the spooks come looking for a search warrant. It would require the feds to have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that a specific search term, such as a specific phone number or the like, that was associated with international terrorism in order to get a warrant to search phone records. It would prohibit the NSA from making these kind of broad requests for like all the phone records from a given city or state or zip code. And it provides individuals and institutions and companies with the means to challenge the gag orders that routinely come along with demands from the feds for some kind of information they want under these so-called national security letters or NSLs. Now, as a side effect of this, with the NSA ban on storing phone records and the fact that the FCC requires phone companies to keep customer records for at least 18 months, this would, in effect, create about an 18-month limit on the time the NSA has to go for a warrant. Now, the bill is far from perfect, and some have actually questioned how much protection it actually offers for our privacy, since the warrants would still be issued by the notoriously compliant Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which virtually never rejects a request from the spooks for a search warrant. But it is still a good deal better than what the right-wing leadership of the Senate wants to do, which is to continue the existing collect-it-all provisions of the Act with no changes for another 5 years. So the fight on this is by no means over, but for the moment, embrace the fact that the House of Representatives has loudly declared that the term privacy is not yet antiquated, and that is good news. Our next up this week, we have a Hero Award, which is something we give out occasionally as the occasion arises for someone who just does the right thing on a matter big or small. Now, despite advances made toward the acceptance of LGBT people and LGBT rights, there is still a taboo. One that, while not as bad as it was, is still a source of unwarranted fears that ultimately can have devastating consequences. The taboo around HIV and its associated disease, AIDS. Now, a German men's magazine called The Vangardist has taken a dramatic step in an attempt to break that taboo. It has printed 3,000 copies of its May issue with ink infused with HIV-positive blood from 3 volunteers. Now, contrary to some initial reports, it wasn't just the cover that was printed with that ink, but the entire magazine, which included statements from the publishers as to why they did this, and stories from what the magazine called HIV heroes. Now, the magazine says that handling a copy of the edition carries no risk of infection, as it was produced according to the most stringent standards. But I actually would add that the very fact that it was felt necessary to say that, when it's been known for years that HIV, which is the human immunodeficiency virus, it's been known for years that HIV cannot survive very long outside the body, the very fact that they thought it necessary to say it's safe to do this, again, is an indication of the fears that surround the disease. As the publishers noted, despite 30 years of campaigning, activism, and research, HIV remains the 6th biggest cause of death in the world. The number of confirmed cases in 2013 is 80% higher than it was in 2003, and half of HIV cases are detected later certainly than they could have been, because of a lack of testing caused by the social stigma surrounding the virus. Health experts say that ending that stigma is vital to actually fighting and controlling AIDS. Because of the culture of shame and prejudice that still surrounds HIV/AIDS, it deters people from getting tested, and it deters carriers from informing their sexual partners of their HIV status, while at the same time making it difficult for prevention programs to operate in the broader community. The Vangardist has found a dramatic way to confront that stigma and to ask people to confront their own fears. And for that, the publishers of the Vangardist are heroes. All right, now we have an edition of Everything You Need to Know, which is an occasional feature around here where you can learn a great deal about something in a very short time. In this case, it's everything you need to know about why we can't seem to stop corporate corruption in just 2 sentences. On May 12th, the FCC fined Verizon $90 million for allowing and profiting from cramming, which is a corrupt practice in the mobile phone industry where third-party vendors cram charges into a customer's phone bill for services that customer did not buy. On the same day, Verizon announced it was spending nearly 50 times that much, $4.4 billion, to acquire AOL. And that is everything you need to know. And next up, one of our regular features, it's the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. And this time we've got another case of somebody who I may have to retire from getting the award because it makes it too hard on other aspirants because this guy's just too easy a target. But I haven't done that yet. Haven't retired him yet. So for now, the big red nose goes again to the man with the world's most perfect middle name, Senator James Mountain, and that really is his middle name because he clearly has rocks in his head, Inhofe. Because of his mastery of clownishness, a single incident is not enough to earn Inhofe the Clown Award, so I submit to you the following 3 examples, all from the past couple of weeks. First off, in an Earth Day op-ed, Senator Rocks in his Head, who sadly chairs the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Rocks in his Head, who says that global warming is the greatest hoax and a conspiracy because apparently the Bible says so. Senator Rocks in his Head, who not long ago brought a snowball onto the floor of the Senate because he apparently imagined that the fact that it snowed in Washington, D.C. in the winter somehow disproves global warming. Well, in an Earth Day op-ed, Senator Rocks in his Head insisted that Obama's climate action plan, the one intended to deal with the climate change which Rocky claims doesn't exist, that Obama's plan should push nuclear power because otherwise it doesn't do enough, he said, to reduce carbon emissions. In support, he actually favorably quoted James Hansen, the former head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, as saying that we need to use nuclear power in order to combat climate change. He followed this up by saying that as his legacy, the amazing Mr. O, quoting, wants total gun control, he wants to close Gitmo, and then, of course, this is the big thing, he wants to do away with fossil fuels. Oddly enough, Rocky seems to think all of those are bad things. And finally, just last week, apparently having already forgotten what he wrote just a couple of weeks before about how we need to support nuclear power on the claim that it is carbon-free, which it's actually not, it's just less carbon-intensive, but apparently having forgotten he said that, Rocky went on a rambling rant on the Senate floor against cutting the very emissions that nuclear power is supposed to save us from, because he said CO2 is a fertilizer, and so the increase in CO2, which has just hit record levels, is greening the planet. Greening the planet even as it melts glaciers and threatens to inundate low-lying coastlines and leaves California dying of thirst. That picture, by the way, is of what's now a former marina at Lake Mead. And that makes James Inhofe the kind of person who will come to your house after your home got washed away in a flood and grouse that you weren't celebrating the fact that you won't have to water your lawn for some time. Senator James rocks in his head Inhofe, indisputably a clown. All right, our other regular weekly feature. This actually at some point was going to be good news, but instead it turned into the outrage of the week. On Tuesday, in what was called everything from a setback to a stinging rebuke, Senate Democrats refused to be stampeded by President Hopi Changei's campaign of half sweet talk, half mockery, and they refused to give him so-called Trade Promotion Authority, or as more commonly known, Fast Track Authority, on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the proposed trade deal accurately labeled by Representative Keith Ellison as the biggest corporate power grab you never heard of. The TPP would create a free trade zone covering 12 Pacific nations and 40% of the world's economy, make it the biggest trade deal since the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, the one that liberalized trade among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, a deal which is responsible for the U.S. losing millions of high-paying manufacturing jobs in exchange for millions of low-paying service industry jobs. Now, the TPP has been in negotiation for some years. I first mentioned it here on this show, in fact, 2.5 years ago. It's been negotiated in secret with input from governments, trade and industry associations, and corporations, and essentially none from labor groups, environmental groups, human rights organizations, or consumers, none, that is, from any of the voices whose concerns lay beyond power, privilege, and profit. Fast Track Authority, this is what this means. It means that once this trade deal is completed, it would be presented to Congress as a single bulk. It would get a yes or no, an up or down vote, but no amendments allowed, no filibustering allowed. This is a procedure that is used only for trade agreements and is intentionally designed to make it as easy as possible to get them passed. 3 weeks ago, I called the push for a Fast Track Authority on this the outrage of the week. But I was being aware of the growing resistance to the TPP among progressives, including some in Congress, I added that Fast Track Authority was not a done deal. And for a moment it looked like it wasn't. On Tuesday, again, a vote on a procedural motion needed to move Fast Track forward got only 52 of the 60 votes it needed. Only one Democrat voted for it. Wow, good news for one day. And then the Senate Democrats, disgustingly, outrageously, they collapsed like a used tissue. Now, originally, these Dems had wanted the Fast Track bill to be bundled with others, including one giving favorable treatment to imports from Africa and cracking down on currency manipulation by China. Currency manipulation being where a country artificially depresses the value of its own currency, which would make its exports, from our point of view, relatively cheaper, and our exports, from their point of view, relatively more expensive, which would have the effect of protecting their domestic industries at our expense. Well, that's what they wanted. Just 24 hours later, the demand for bundling was gone, exchanged for an essentially meaningless promise to vote on those things as separate bills where they will have no legal impact on fast-track authority and thus no real impact on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and which, in fact, the House of Representatives can now, if it chooses, just completely ignore. This means, disgustingly, that Senate Democrats gave away their leverage on trade in exchange for being able to posture to the people back home that they voted to get tough with China. Now, fast-track authority is still not a done deal, since after it gets through the Senate, which it certainly will now due to this craven capitulation, it'll have to be passed by the House, where it's predicted it's going to have an even tougher time, and where a number of Democrats and some Republicans are already on record opposing it. None of that changes the fact that the Senate Democrats had, in practical effect, stopped TPP. They had stopped this latest hosanna to the transnational corporations that dominate international trade and increasingly dominate the governments of the world. They had in effect stopped TPP in its tracks because the amazing Mr. O and the Wall Street minions who surround him know full well that this cannot survive without fast track. It cannot survive open debate. They had in effect stopped it, and they gave it away, threw it away for a mess of pottage. And that, and its potential impact on our economic future, because I don't know how many more victories like NAFTA we can afford, that makes it an outrage. And we're taking a break. And we're back. There is a footnote to what I was just saying about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. One of Obama's favorite sales pitches in favor of the TPP is that it would be great for the U.S. auto industry. In fact, according to him, if this is passed, you'll see Ford Mustangs and Chevy pickups clogging the streets of Tokyo. Last month, he said, and I'm quoting, "I don't know why folks would be opposed to opening up the Japanese market more for U.S. autos." And he said this just before bringing out the level the playing field cliche. The problem is, it just ain't true. First off, Japan imposes no tariffs on U.S. cars shipped to Japan. Rather, in what was in fact an attempt to protect the U.S. auto industry, there are tariffs on Japanese cars imported to the United States. Tariffs which would be reduced as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which means that rather than opening up Japan to U.S. cars, the pact would more open the U.S. market to Japanese cars. Now, you can argue about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. But what you can claim is that this would help the U.S. auto industry. Oh, but there are non-tariff barriers that keep U.S. cars out of the Japanese market, according to the amazing Mr. O and his Wall Street minions. And they say those will be dealt with as well, be assured. Okay, except that the big three U.S. automakers, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, are all wary of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in part because of its lack of controls on currency manipulation. Currency manipulation, again, is a way that a nation can manipulate its currency to its own trade advantage, something in which Japan has notoriously engaged in the past. And interestingly, Obama opposes currency controls. But what's more, even beyond that, auto industry analysts have long said that the real problem in expanding the U.S. auto industry's reach into Japan is that the Japanese just don't want American cars. They prefer smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles to the kind that Detroit insists on making, where words like room, performance, and power hold sway. Senator Sherrod Brown observed that past trade deals promising jobs have failed to deliver on that promise over and over again. I've seen the same quoting him, "I've seen the same promises, more jobs, higher wages. The jobs don't materialize. The promises are remade." This, it seems, is just another example of the same thing. All right, we're going to end up this week with an update about something I've talked about in the past, specifically civil forfeiture or civil asset forfeiture, it's also called. I've talked about this a few times. In fact, I first mentioned it on this show something over 2 years ago. And most recently, I mentioned it earlier this year. And so, but although I've talked about it before, I'm going to do a little refresher before I do the update. Civil forfeiture is a corrupt and corruption-ridden practice that arose out of the so-called war on drugs. It allows police to seize assets based on nothing more than their claim of a belief that these assets are related to illegal drug activity or were purchased with the proceeds of illegal drug activity. They can do this even if they have no basis for charges against the person whose property is being seized. In many cases, you do not need to be convicted of a crime to have your stuff taken away from you. You do not even have to be accused of a crime to have your stuff officially stolen from you. And no, I am not exaggerating, not one tiny bit. Under this program, cops have seized money, computers, TV, jewelries, cars, even homes and businesses without ever presenting or even having to present a shred of evidence that the prior owners had done anything wrong. And once your property is seized, it's your responsibility to somehow prove the negative, that it was not involved in anything illegal. So it's become sadly commonplace for cops to just take and keep whatever money or other valuables they find during traffic stops under the claim it's the result of illegal activity and therefore can be seized. Now, civil forfeiture of this sort actually has a long history. It was actually one of the things that drove the American Revolution. And it was one of the things that the part of the Fourth Amendment, referring to people being secure in their effects against unreasonable seizures, and the part of the Fifth Amendment about no property being taken from you without due process, these provisions were designed to prevent this kind of civil forfeiture. And except for limited cases such as piracy, civil forfeiture was not used much in the United States until, fittingly, 1984. That's when Congress passed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which established a special fund that turned over proceeds from forfeitures to the law enforcement agencies responsible for them. Now, the value of the assets seized did not go into the general fund. Most of it went to the cops and prosecutors. Put another way, cops now had a profit motive to seize property. The result? At the Justice Department, remember this is a federal law, so we're talking here about federal actions. At the Justice Department, proceeds from such forfeiture went from $27 million in 1985 to $556 million in 1995 to $4.2 billion in 2012. Since 1984, most, if not all, states have adopted their own civil forfeiture laws, but many that come with standards that are clearly stricter than the federal ones. Standards involve particularly being able to show actual evidence of related criminal activity. But there was a huge loophole, a federal program called, creepily enough, equitable sharing, which included a provision under which the feds could adopt seizures done by state cops, which could then be justified under the looser federal rules. The feds would keep 20% then of the value of what was seized, 80% went to the local police departments. Now, there was some degree of good news on this particular front in January when Eric Holder said he was ending the adoptive seizure program that was part of equitable sharing. However, this obviously did not apply to joint state-federal operations and obviously, again, did not apply to state-level seizures. And despite the fact that a number of states had stricter rules than the feds, a lot of the others didn't. As a result, there were those who said that Holder's move didn't amount to much. In fact, a study by the Libertarian Institute for Justice found that adoptive seizures under this program accounted for only 25% of all property seized under the program and only about 10% of the total value of assets seized under the program. And all of that was true, of course. But I noted at the time, back in January, that holders' action did not come in a vacuum. It came in the face of more and more questions being asked about the entire civil asset forfeiture program and about the whole value of the program. And I suggested at the time that by doing this, he had actually brought more attention to civil asset forfeiture, to this whole corrupt business, which I thought was likely to spur more outrage and thus more action in more states. Which brings us to the update. Last month, New Mexico enacted a new law which requires authorities to obtain a conviction or a guilty plea before they can move to seize property. It also puts proceeds from those seizures into the general fund rather than into the budgets of the local police departments, largely removing the cops' profit motive for making seizures. The ACLU of New Mexico called this a good day for the Bill of Rights. This month, Montana Governor Steve Bullock signed a bill to overhaul that state's civil asset forfeiture laws, a bill that was passed, as was the one in New Mexico, with overwhelming bipartisan support. Now, as in New Mexico, this new Montana law, which is to go into effect in July, requires conviction of a crime before the state can move to seize property. It also raises the legal threshold for forfeiture, that the seized you have to have a higher standard of proof that the property was connected to illegal activity. Before it was the rather limp probable cause. Now it requires clear and convincing evidence. Also, the the Montana law establishes a number of protections for those whose property is targeted for seizure, such as like a pre-trial process, where you have a chance to defend your property before it's taken from you. Now, however, unlike the New Mexico law, the Montana law does not move all proceeds into the general fund, leaving open the loophole of the joint state-federal operations under equitable sharing. The bill's chief sponsor in Montana says he's going to keep an eye out to see if more legislation proves to be necessary. Finally for now, there is a new bill in California which was introduced in April, which would require a conviction in all cases before there could be an asset seizure, which closed a loophole in state law, under which it was actually easier to make big seizures than small ones. The bill would also move some of the proceeds now going to prosecutors, law enforcement, and the general fund to the court system and, interestingly, the Office of Public Defenders, and says that the equitable sharing program can't be used by cops to evade state requirements. Now, a similar bill in California failed to make it out of committee in 2012, but the ground is different now. And we'll have to see if California is prepared to have Montana out in front of it on matters concerning privacy and Fourth Amendment rights. Meanwhile, we can continue putting forth the effort to see if we can actually ultimately put an end to the corrupt official thievery that is civil asset forfeiture. All right, that's it for this week. I'm actually going to wrap up there. Everything else is going to have to wait till next week. Next week's going to be a little bit interesting because I'll tell you now that I'm going to be away for a while. So next week there's going to be a new show, but what's on it is not going to be time critical. It's not going to be up-to-the-minute news. So just be prepared for that, more general discussion on a couple of topics. For now, we will just leave it at that, and I will say to you, have the best week you possibly can, and peace.